The auctioneer's voice cut through the September air like a hot blade through dry corn silk. And standing at the back of that crowd, just far enough away that nobody'd notice if he had to leave, was a man named Eldon Pruitt, 51 years old, worn canvas coat, boots that had seen more mud than most men see in a lifetime. He wasn't there to buy anything that day. He was there because they were selling his neighbor's farm, piece by piece, row by row. Marion County sits in the south-central part of Iowa, just southeast of Des Moines, in that broad, flat stretch of ground where the soil runs dark and deep and the sky seems bigger than anywhere else on Earth. In 1971, the land there was still alive with possibility. The farm boom of the 1960s had put cash in people's pockets and optimism in their chests. Corn prices were creeping upward. The government was talking about feeding the world. Eldon Pruitt was not a complicated man. He was 5'10", lean as a fence post, with hands so calloused and thick that his wife Dorothy used to say shaking hands with Eldon was like shaking hands with a good leather glove. He didn't talk much. He didn't need to. Now let me tell you about Dale Whitmore, because you need to understand him to understand what happened. Dale was 44 years old in 1971. His father, Gerald Whitmore, had built the dealership on honesty and hard work and a handshake that meant something. Dale had inherited the business and the building, but somewhere along the way, he'd also inherited a set of opinions about people that his father never had. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever stood in a crowd and watched something happen that you knew was wrong and felt absolutely powerless to stop it? That's where Eldon Pruitt stood on the morning of September 14, 1971. His neighbor, Harold Fentress, had gone under. Harold had done what a lot of Marion County farmers were doing in those years. He'd borrowed heavily to expand, bought a new John Deere 4020 diesel on credit in 1968 for $7,200, added another 80 acres on a land contract that ate his cash flow alive, and then watched corn prices stall just long enough and interest rates climb just enough that the numbers stopped working. The bank in Knoxville called the note in August. By September, they were auctioning everything Harold owned. The Fentress Farm auction drew 200 people. That's not unusual. Auctions in rural Iowa in 1971 were social events as much as commercial ones. People came to see what things were worth, to maybe pick up a piece of equipment, and sometimes, if we're being honest, to watch the spectacle of a man's life being sold off an acre and an implement at a time. Dale Whitmore was there in his capacity as a dealer. He'd pick up the 4020 if it went cheap enough and clean it up for resale. He was standing near the front with two of his salesmen, holding a coffee in a paper cup, and he was in a fine mood. When he spotted Eldon Pruitt at the back of the crowd, he made his way over. Eldon, he extended a hand. Eldon shook it. Dale, see, you came out to watch the proceedings. Dale smiled, not unkindly exactly, but with that particular flavor of condescension that certain men have perfected, the kind that sounds like friendliness but carries a sting underneath. Came to pay my respects to Harold, Eldon said. Sure, Dale nodded, looking out at the equipment lined up across Fentress's yard. You know, this is what happens when a man gets overextended, sad thing. He shook his head, then he looked at Eldon. Course, some men never had that problem. Can't get overextended when you're not extended at all, right? A few people nearby heard that. Someone chuckled softly. Eldon looked at him steadily. That's right, he said. Dale pressed it. He couldn't help himself. I saw that old M of yours down the road last week, still running that thing. Oh yes. Lord, Dale shook his head again, but he was smiling now and the smile had grown teeth. Eldon, that tractor was old when Eisenhower was president. You know, I've got a 3020 on the lot right now, real clean, that I could put you in for $3,200 with a trade, get you into the modern era. He said the last part louder than he needed to. More people turned to listen now. Auctions have a way of making conversations public. I'm all right, Eldon said. You're going to plant 500 acres with a 1948 M? Dale laughed. The laugh was genuine, which somehow made it worse. Eldon, I got customers running 4020s who'll be done with their corn by the time you get halfway through your first pass. I'm serious. That machine it's a relic. It belongs in a museum, not in a field. The auctioneer's voice started up somewhere behind them. Harold Fentress, who had walked over during the last part of this exchange, looked at the ground. Eldon Pruitt said nothing for a moment, and then he said very quietly, Harold, I'm sorry about all this. If you need anything, you call. He nodded at Dale Whitmore once, not coldly, not warmly, just the acknowledgement of a man who has decided a conversation is over. And he walked away. Dale Whitmore watched him go. Then he turned to his salesman and said, with the easy certainty of a man who has never been truly wrong about anything important, that man will be broke inside of 5 years. Mark my words. Now let me tell you what Dale Whitmore didn't know about Eldon Pruitt. He didn't know about the notebooks. Eldon had kept a notebook since 1957, a simple composition book, the kind school kids use, filled with his cramped, careful handwriting. In it, he recorded everything: fuel consumption per acre, hours on the engine between oil changes, the particular way the carburetor needle needed adjusting in cold weather versus hot weather, the shimmy in the front axle that appeared every spring after frost heave, and how many turns of the adjustment bolt it took to correct it. The exact fuel mixture that gave the best pull in heavy clay soil. 14 years of observation. 14 years of knowing his machine better than its manufacturer did by that point. But that wasn't all. Let me tell you about the Farmall M's engine, because it matters. The M ran a C164 four-cylinder engine, 164 cubic inches of displacement, producing about 26 drawbar horsepower when new. Not impressive by 1971 standards. The new 4020 was pushing 91 horsepower. On paper, it wasn't a comparison. It was a joke. But Eldon Pruitt had spent years understanding something about power that most people with new iron never had to think about: efficiency. The ratio of what you put into what you get out. How you work the ground matters more than how much horsepower you've got if you know what you're doing. He'd also, and this is the part that really matters, learned to rebuild. In 1969, Eldon had spent the better part of that winter in his machine shed with his M torn down to the block. He'd had the cylinders rebored at a machine shop in Indianola, cost him $180. He'd installed new pistons and rings. He'd rebuilt the magneto from scratch using a kit he'd ordered from a supplier out of Moline, Illinois, for $34. He'd reground the valves himself, lapping them in by hand until the compression in every cylinder was within 2 pounds per square inch of each other. When he put that engine back together and fired it up in January of 1970, it ran smoother than it had when it was new. He'd also, and this is the part that raised eyebrows among those who noticed, modified the fuel system. Eldon had read about distillate fuel conversions. He'd talked to an old IH mechanic in Pella who'd been doing this since the 40s. He'd converted the M to run on a blend of gasoline and distillate, cheaper per gallon than straight gasoline, and with the right carburetor adjustment, nearly as efficient in terms of BTUs per horsepower hour. In 1971, when fuel was 28 cents a gallon and the difference between profit and loss on a corn crop was sometimes measured in cents per bushel, Eldon Pruitt's fuel cost per acre was lower than that of any operator in his township. Not by a little, by a third. And his machine, with its rebuilt engine and its properly adjusted governor and its hand-tuned carburetor, was making nearly the same hours per breakdown ratio as a brand new tractor, because Eldon fixed problems before they became problems. He listened. He paid attention. He knew the difference between the sound of an engine running right and the sound of an engine that was about to run wrong. Now ask yourself this. In 1971, while Harold Fentress was drowning in payments on his $7,200 John Deere 4020, and Dale Whitmore was laughing at Eldon Pruitt's old M, who was actually ahead. The years between 1971 and 1979 were good ones for Eldon Pruitt. Corn prices climbed. The 1972 grain deal with the Soviet Union sent commodity prices surging, and by 1974, corn was trading at prices that would have seemed like fantasy in 1965. Land values in Marion County were rising every year, sometimes month over month. Eldon Pruitt planted his 160 acres every spring with his Farmall M. He cultivated. He harvested. He paid his property taxes in full every November, drove to the Knoxville bank and wrote the check himself, and thanked the teller by name. He bought no new equipment. He didn't need to. His M, rebuilt, tuned, pampered the way some men pamper horses, was giving him everything he needed. His yields were not the highest in the county, but his costs were among the lowest. And at the end of every season, more money stayed in the Pruitt household than went out. He put some of it in the bank. He put some of it into his land. He tilled 3 low-lying acres in the East Field in 1973, hired it done right with proper drainage tile, the kind that would last 50 years. He limed the fields on schedule. He rotated properly. He was, in the quiet way of men who don't call attention to themselves, getting stronger every year. Dale Whitmore, meanwhile, was expanding. The boom years were good for implement dealers too, and Dale had ridden them hard. He'd added a second lot in 1974. He'd taken on a line of larger equipment, the John Deere 6030, the 7520 big articulated machines for big operators. He'd hired 4 more salesmen. He'd borrowed against the business to finance inventory, which in a rising market is the kind of bet that makes you feel like a genius. By 1979, Whitmore Farm Equipment was a $3 million operation. And then the 1980s happened. Let me pause here and ask you something if you're old enough to remember. Do you remember where you were when you first realized the farm crisis wasn't just a rumor? When does it start to feel real? Because it was real. It was as real as anything that has ever happened to American agriculture. Interest rates climbed to 20%. Land values that had doubled and tripled through the 70s began to fall and then fall faster, and then collapse. Farmers who had borrowed to expand found themselves holding land worth a fraction of what they'd paid for it, servicing debt at interest rates that would have seemed criminal a decade earlier. The equipment business dried up overnight. Men who had been buying new tractors every 4 years suddenly weren't buying anything. They were fixing what they had. They were doing what Eldon Pruitt had been doing for 30 years. By 1982, Dale Whitmore's inventory was sitting on his lot unsold. His floor plan financing, the loans he'd taken to stock that inventory, was costing him $18,000 a month in interest. His big operators, the men he'd staked his reputation on, the ones running the 7520s and the 4440s, were going under one by one. Some of them owed him money. Some of them owed him a lot of money. By 1984, Whitmore Farm Equipment was struggling. And in the spring of 1986, on a Tuesday morning in April, the bank called the note. Word travels fast in a county seat of 12,000 people. By the time news got out that Whitmore Farm Equipment was going to auction, the whole lot, the inventory, the building, the second location, most of Marion County already knew. The auction was set for May 3, 1986. Eldon Pruitt heard about it from his neighbor Jim Caldwell over the fence on a Monday afternoon in late April. He listened without expression while Jim told him what he knew about the sale. Then he nodded slowly, thanked Jim, and walked back to his machine shed. He stood for a moment in the doorway looking at his Farmall M, 38 years old now. Still red mostly, still running. He went inside and called his banker in Knoxville. His name was Gary Heimbuck, a careful, methodical man who had watched the farm crisis with growing alarm and had been one of the few Marion County lenders to come through it in reasonably good shape, because he'd been cautious about the loans he approved on the way up. Gary, Eldon said, I need to know what I've got available. He had $47,000 in savings. He had 160 acres of free and clear land that appraised, even in the collapsed market of 1986, at approximately $800 per acre, $128,000 in real property, unencumbered. Gary Heimbuck was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Eldon, what are you thinking about doing? Eldon told him. Gary was quiet again for longer this time, and then he said, come in Thursday morning, we'll talk about what we can put together. May 3, 1986 was a cool, gray Saturday in Knoxville, Iowa. The kind of spring day that can't quite decide whether it wants to be winter still, where the clouds sit low and the air smells like rain that hasn't arrived yet. The crowd at the Whitmore Farm Equipment auction was smaller than the crowd at the Fentress auction had been 15 years earlier. 200 people at a farm auction in 1971 meant optimism, possibility, the sense of a world expanding. 130 people at an implement dealer auction in 1986 meant something else entirely. It meant everyone was cautious. It meant nobody wanted to be the one who overpaid. Dale Whitmore was there, he had to be, it was his business. He stood near the office door in a gray jacket, not green this time, no gold pin. He was 60 years old. The years of the crisis had aged him in ways that were hard to precisely define but easy to see. The easy confidence was gone. Something had replaced it that looked, if you were watching carefully, a lot like the expression of a man who has been wrong about something important and is only now beginning to understand the full dimensions of his error. The auctioneer, a man named Bud Tarver from Des Moines, the same firm that had handled the Fentress auction, which was either a coincidence or fate depending on your disposition, started with the smaller items. Tool sets, shop equipment, a parts washer, and air compressor. Then he moved into real estate. The lot on Lincoln Avenue in Knoxville is 1.4 acres of commercial ground with a 2-bay service building, a showroom, and a parts department. Appraised by the bank at $340,000 in the optimistic years. Starting bid today, $95,000. Let me tell you what happened next, because I want you to feel it. The bidding opened, a couple of bidders pushed it to $112,000, then $118,000, then it stalled. And from somewhere near the back of the crowd, not the very back, but close, a quiet man in a worn canvas coat raised his hand. $120,000. Bud Tarver looked at him, took his number, looked around the crowd. No counters. He tried, he coaxed. He gave it 30 seconds that felt longer. No counters. Sold, he said, to bidder number 47, $120,000. There was a moment, and if you've ever been at an auction where something unexpected happens, you know this moment. It lasts only a second or two, but it feels different from regular time, where the crowd was absolutely, completely quiet. And then somebody near the front turned around to see who number 47 was. And then a few more people turned. And then Dale Whitmore, who had been standing near the office door and had heard the number called and had turned like everyone else to find the buyer, looked across that concrete lot and saw Eldon Pruitt looking back at him. Eldon didn't smile, he wasn't gloating, that wasn't who he was. He just looked at Dale Whitmore the way a quiet man looks at the conclusion of a long story. And then he looked away and went to find the auctioneer's clerk to complete the paperwork. In the months after the auction, people in Knoxville talked about it the way small towns talk about things that feel like they mean something beyond themselves. Because the story had a shape to it that people recognized. It was the shape of a long arc bending somewhere specific. Eldon Pruitt paid $120,000 for the Whitmore farm equipment lot and building at auction. Gary Heimbuck at the bank had worked out a commercial loan using the farm as collateral, a 15-year note at a rate that, by 1986 standards, was actually favorable, because rates had finally started coming down from their crisis-era peaks. Eldon didn't reopen it as an equipment dealership. He wasn't in that business. He leased the building, the main lot and the showroom, to a farm supply cooperative out of Indianola that needed a Knoxville location, and he leased the second bay to an independent mechanic named Paul Ashworth who did small engine and tractor repair. Between the two leases, his monthly income from the property covered his loan payment with $400 to spare. He went on farming his 160 acres. His Farmall M, serial number FAD 277,843, now 38 years old, was still in service. He'd done another engine rebuild in 1983. New head gasket, reset the valves, and new water pump impeller. He'd repainted it in the summer of 1985. Not perfectly, not with a professional spray gun, but with a brush and good enamel paint in the right shade of Farmall red, the color called Persian orange in the IH color charts, though nobody ever called it that, and it came out looking, as Dorothy Pruitt said, like it means business again. In 1988, corn prices stabilized and began to recover. The worst of the farm crisis was over, though the damage it had done to rural communities would take decades to fully account for, and some of it never really would be. Dale Whitmore did not go completely broke. His house was separate from the business assets. He had a small pension. He went to work in the fall of 1986 as a sales representative for a farm input company out of Des Moines, driving a territory that covered several counties, selling seed treatments and fertilizer blends to farmers who some of them had bought green tractors from him 20 years earlier. It was honest work. It paid decently. It was not the same as standing in your own showroom, watching your own lot full of your own iron. He drove through Knoxville sometimes on his route. He drove past the lot on Lincoln Avenue. The co-op had a new sign-up by 1987. Paul Ashworth's shop had a hand-lettered sign in the bay window that said Tractor Work, all MAKES, all models. In the spring of 1989, Dale Whitmore stopped his car on Lincoln Avenue and sat for a while looking at the building. A man who knew both Eldon and Dale told this story years later at a church social. Said he'd heard from Paul Ashworth that Dale had come by the shop one afternoon, asked if he could look around inside, and Paul had said sure and let him walk through. And that Dale had stood in the middle of the main bay for a while, not saying much, looking at the oil-stained floor and the light through the high windows. He didn't say anything particular, Paul had told this man, just looked around, then he thanked me and left. That's all that story has, sometimes that's enough. Eldon Pruitt's land increased in value through the late 1980s and into the 1990s. By the time he sold the commercial property in 1994 to the co-op directly, which wanted to own their location, he sold it for $218,000. He paid off the remaining balance on his loan. The net to Eldon after fees and payoff was $89,000 in clear profit on a $120,000 investment, not a Wall Street return, but a Marion County return. Real money from real ground that had held its value because Eldon Pruitt had known what he was doing when nobody was watching. The farm he never sold. Dorothy Pruitt died in 1997. Eldon farmed until 2003 when his own knees finally told him it was time. He sold the tillable acres to a neighboring operation but kept the house, the machine shed, and the yard. His son Kenneth took the farm, still running, though it hadn't been in a field in a couple of years, and put it under a shed roof and covered it with a canvas tarp. The last time anyone in Hamilton, Iowa, saw it run, it started on the third pull of the rope. 37 years of work, and it started on the third pull. Let me tell you what I think this story is really about. It's easy to say it's about patience. It's easy to say it's about the tortoise and the hare, the old machine and the new one, humility versus arrogance. All of that is true, but I think there's something underneath those things that's worth sitting with. Eldon Pruitt was never trying to prove anything. That's the part that matters most. He wasn't running his old farm to make a point. He wasn't saving his money and staying debt-free to set up some dramatic moment 15 years later when the man who'd laughed at him would have to watch him sign the papers on his lot. He was just living correctly. Day by day, season by season, making decisions based on what he actually knew and what he could actually afford and what he actually needed. Not based on what the showroom floor told him he should want. Not based on what his neighbors were doing. Not based on the story that the boom years were telling about how things would always get better and bigger. He understood his machine. That's what this comes down to, not just the engine and the carburetor and the compression ratios, though he understood all of those, but the larger machine. The machine of his own operation. The inputs and the outputs, the costs and the returns, the difference between what something costs you and what it's worth. Dale Whitmore understood green paint and floor plan financing and the feeling of standing in a full showroom. Those things are nothing, but they are not the whole machine. There's a particular kind of pride that comes from new things. From the latest model, the highest horsepower rating, the most impressive equipment is parked where everyone can see it. And there's nothing wrong with that pride in itself. The problem is when that pride becomes a lens that distorts everything you look at, when it makes you see other men's choices as failures instead of different calculations, when it makes you laugh at what you don't understand. Eldon Pruitt never laughed at anybody, not once. Not at Dale Whitmore's showroom full of iron that would end up auctioned at 50 cents on the dollar. Not at Harold Fentress's mistake in borrowing too much. He understood how a man gets to that place, how reasonable every step seems in the moment. He just went to the auction and paid his respects. Let me pause here and ask you something one last time. Think about the machines in your own life, the tools, the methods, the ways of doing things that maybe look old-fashioned to people looking in from outside. The things other people might laugh at. Are you sure they're wrong, or is it possible that what looks like stubbornness is actually knowledge? That's what looks like falling behind is actually a different kind of staying ahead. Eldon Pruitt knew something that can't be financed and can't be traded in and doesn't depreciate. He knew himself. He knew what he was doing and why he was doing it, and that knowledge was worth more than any showroom ever built on Lincoln Avenue in Knoxville, Iowa. His farm sat under a canvas tarp in Hamilton for years after he stopped farming. Last report anyone gave, the engine is still in there, still intact, still rebuildable. Some things, if you take care of them the right way, outlast everything that was supposed to replace them. Some quiet men do too. Pause, slow fade. They said Eldon Pruitt's operation was behind the times. They said his machine was a relic. They said he'd never make it. He farmed his land for 48 years. He paid every debt he ever owed. He bought the lot. And on the last morning, no one saw it run. That old farm started on the third pull of the rope. That's Marion County, Iowa. That's 1971 to 1986. That's Eldon Pruitt. Let me tell you, there's a lot more where that came from. Historical context is real. Characters and dialogue are dramatized for storytelling.